The fluorescent lights in the Missouri History Museum's restoration lab hummed with their usual mechanical persistence as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her magnifying lens over the daguerreotype. Outside, October rain pelted the windows of the Forest Park building, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the city beyond. She had been working alone in the lab for 3 hours, lost in the meticulous world of digital restoration where pixels held more truth than memory. The photograph before her was a relic from 1852, its silvered surface tarnished and clouded by more than a century and a half of neglect. According to the acquisition notes, it had been discovered in the estate sale of a recently deceased St. Louis collector, tucked away in a moldering trunk alongside other Civil War-era memorabilia. What made this particular daguerreotype special was its subject. Dan Rice, America's most famous clown of the mid-19th century, captured during what historians believed was his 1852 performance tour through Missouri. Sarah pushed a strand of auburn hair behind her ear and leaned closer to her workstation. The high-resolution scanner had already captured the image at 2400 dpi, and now she was using specialized software to slowly peel away the layers of damage that time had inflicted. Each adjustment revealed more detail, more life frozen in silver and copper. Dan Rice's face emerged from the digital shadows like a ghost materializing in candlelight. His white grease paint was cracked and yellowed in the original, but Sarah's restoration was bringing back the stark contrast that would have made Victorian audiences gasp with delight. His red nose, painted in what appeared to be genuine cinnabar, glowed with renewed vibrancy. But it was his smile that commanded attention, a wide theatrical grin that seemed to stretch beyond the natural limits of human expression. "There you are," Sarah whispered to the screen, her voice barely audible above the lab's ambient noise. She had been working on historical photography restoration for 8 years, ever since completing her master's degree in art conservation, but there was something about this image that felt different. The way Dan Rice's eyes seemed to hold secrets, the way his smile appeared to shift slightly each time she looked away and back again. She applied another layer of noise reduction to clean up the grain that had accumulated over the decades. The software worked its magic, smoothing out imperfections while preserving the essential character of the original image. As the processing completed, Sarah noticed something odd in the lower right quadrant of Rice's painted smile. A shadow that didn't quite belong, a darkness that seemed to have depth beyond the flat surface of the daguerreotype. Her phone buzzed with a text message, breaking her concentration. It was her boyfriend, Marcus, asking if she wanted to grab dinner when she finished work. Sarah glanced at the clock, 7:30 p.m. She had completely lost track of time, something that happened frequently when she was deep in a restoration project. She typed back a quick response promising to be done within the hour, then returned her attention to the mysterious shadow. Using the software's enhancement tools, she increased the contrast in the specific area that had caught her attention. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Within the painted curves of Dan Rice's theatrical smile, another face was becoming visible. Not painted on, but somehow embedded within the very structure of the image itself. It was a face contorted in what appeared to be a scream, its mouth open wide in an expression of pure terror. Sarah blinked hard and rubbed her eyes, thinking that perhaps the long hours and close work had created some kind of optical illusion. But when she looked back at the screen, the screaming face was still there, clearer now, as if her observation had somehow brought it into sharper focus. The face appeared to be that of a young woman, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with an agony that transcended the century and a half that separated her from Sarah's world. The restoration expert's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, finding it empty and cold. She had seen many strange things emerge from old photographs during the restoration process, previous repairs, hidden signatures, even images that had been deliberately obscured. But this was different. This looked like a completely separate photograph, somehow superimposed or double-exposed onto the Dan Rice image, yet the metadata showed no evidence of digital manipulation or multiple exposures. She saved her work and leaned back in her chair, trying to process what she was seeing. The screaming face wasn't just visible within Dan Rice's smile, it seemed to be emerging from it, as if the clown's painted grin was somehow a doorway or window into another moment, another tragedy frozen in time. The woman's expression was so vivid, so full of genuine terror, that Sarah felt her own heart rate increase just looking at it. Outside, the October storm intensified, and a flash of lightning briefly illuminated the lab in stark white light. In that moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw the screaming face move slightly, its mouth opening wider in silent agony. But when the normal fluorescent lighting returned, everything appeared exactly as it had been before. She decided to run one more enhancement pass, this time focusing specifically on the area where the hidden face had appeared. As the software processed the image, revealing ever finer details, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach clench with unease. Around the edges of the screaming woman's face, she could make out what appeared to be hands. Multiple hands reaching toward the woman, grasping at her as if trying to pull her deeper into some unseen darkness. The hands were pale, almost skeletal, with long fingers that seemed to emerge from the very paint of Dan Rice's smile. They weren't part of any costume or theatrical prop. They looked disturbingly real, desperate, and somehow hungry. Sarah's phone rang, startling her so badly that she nearly knocked over her empty coffee cup. It was Marcus again, probably wondering why she hadn't responded to his dinner invitation. She let it go to voicemail, unable to look away from the screen. The enhancement was complete, and now the hidden image was so clear that she could make out individual tears on the woman's face, the texture of her period clothing, even what appeared to be a small locket around her neck. But most disturbing of all was the realization that the screaming woman looked familiar. Not personally familiar, but her clothing, her hairstyle, even the style of jewelry she wore, all seemed to match the 1852 time period of the Dan Rice photograph. This wasn't some random double exposure or processing error. Somehow this woman's final moments had been captured within the same frame as the clown's performance, hidden for over 170 years until Sarah's digital restoration had finally brought her screaming face into the light. Sarah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the screaming woman's face, frozen in an expression of terror that seemed to reach across the centuries. By 6 a.m., she had given up on rest entirely and found herself back at the museum nursing her third cup of coffee while poring over the Dan Rice photograph on her computer screen. In the harsh morning light streaming through the lab windows, she had hoped that what she'd seen the previous evening might reveal itself as some kind of optical illusion or processing error, but the hidden image remained stubbornly present, perhaps even clearer than before. The woman's anguished face stared back at her from within Dan Rice's theatrical grin, surrounded by those pale, grasping hands that seemed to emerge from the very essence of the clown's painted smile. Sarah had printed out several versions of the enhanced image, each one highlighting different aspects of the hidden photograph. Spread across her desk like pieces of a macabre puzzle, they told a story she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair partially covered by what looked like a torn bonnet. Her dress was typical of the 1850s, dark fabric with a high collar and fitted bodice that suggested she came from a respectable middle-class family. What disturbed Sarah most was the clarity of the woman's expression. This wasn't the stylized pose of a Victorian portrait or the theatrical exaggeration of a performer. This was raw, genuine terror, captured in a moment of absolute desperation. The woman's eyes were wide with fear, her mouth open in what Sarah could only imagine was a scream that had been silenced by time itself. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the museum's chief curator, arrived at her usual time of 8:30 a.m. to find Sarah already deep in research. The older woman paused in the doorway of the restoration lab, taking in the scattered printouts and Sarah's obviously sleepless appearance. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Dr. Hartwell observed, setting down her own coffee and approaching Sarah's workstation. "What has you so captivated by our circus clown?" Sarah gestured to the main monitor, where the enhanced Dan Rice photograph filled the screen. "Look at his smile, really look at it. Do you see anything unusual?" Dr. Hartwell leaned forward, adjusting her glasses as she studied the image. Sarah watched her supervisor's face carefully, wondering if the hidden image was visible to others, or if she was experiencing some kind of breakdown brought on by too many late nights in the lab. After several long moments, Dr. Hartwell straightened up with a puzzled expression. "The restoration work is exceptional, Sarah. You've really brought out the detail in Rice's costume and makeup, but I'm not sure what specifically you want me to notice about his smile." Sarah's heart sank. She pulled up one of the enhanced versions that clearly showed the screaming woman's face and pointed directly at it. "Here, can you see the woman's face embedded in the smile? The hands reaching for her?" Dr. Hartwell studied the screen again, squinting at the area Sarah indicated. After a moment, she shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but I don't see what you're referring to. Are you sure you haven't been working too many long hours? Sometimes when we stare at these old images for extended periods, our minds can start to see patterns that aren't really there. The dismissal stung, but Sarah wasn't entirely surprised. Throughout her career, she had learned that digital restoration often revealed details that were invisible to casual observation. Perhaps whatever process had hidden the woman's image within the Dan Rice photograph only became visible through specific enhancement techniques. After Dr. Hartwell left to attend to other museum business, Sarah decided to research the historical context of the photograph. If the hidden image was real, there might be some record of what had happened during Dan Rice's 1852 visit to St. Louis that could explain the presence of the terrified woman. She began with the museum's extensive archives, searching for any documentation related to Dan Rice's performances in the city. Rice had been one of America's most famous entertainers in the mid-19th century, known for his political satire and his trained pig, Lord Byron. His shows had drawn massive crowds wherever he performed, and his influence on American popular culture had been enormous. What Sarah found in the archives made her increasingly uneasy. According to newspaper accounts from the St. Louis Republican and the Missouri Democrat, Dan Rice had indeed performed in the city during October of 1852. His shows had been held at the Varieties Theatre on Market Street, and by all accounts, they had been tremendously successful. But there were also reports of strange incidents during his week-long engagement. A brief item in the October 15, 1852 edition of the St. Louis Republican mentioned that a young woman named Catherine Morrison had gone missing after attending one of Rice's evening performances. The article was only 3 lines long, noting that the 22-year-old daughter of a local merchant had failed to return home after the show and that her family was requesting information about her whereabouts. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read the name, Catherine Morrison. She immediately began searching for additional information about the missing woman, but the newspaper archives from that period were incomplete. What she did find, however, was disturbing enough. 3 days after Catherine Morrison's disappearance, the St. Louis Republican published a longer article about what they called unfortunate incidents associated with the Rice performances. 2 other young women had been reported missing following evening shows, and there had been what the paper described as disturbances of a violent nature in the theatre district. The article was carefully worded, clearly avoiding any direct accusations, but it painted a picture of a city in the grip of unexplained fear. Witnesses reported seeing strange figures lurking near the Varieties Theatre, and several patrons claimed to have heard screaming coming from the building long after the evening performances had ended. Most chilling of all was a brief mention that Dan Rice had abruptly cancelled the final 2 performances of his scheduled engagement and left St. Louis under circumstances of some urgency. The newspaper suggested that local authorities had requested his departure, though no formal charges were ever filed. Sarah printed out the articles and spread them across her desk next to the enhanced photographs. The pieces of a dark puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than she had imagined. If the screaming woman in the photograph was indeed Catherine Morrison, then somehow her final moments had been captured within the very image of the man who might have been responsible for her disappearance. She turned back to her computer and began a new search, this time looking for any record of Catherine Morrison's fate. What she discovered in a digitized coroner's report from November 1852 made her blood run cold. Catherine Morrison's body had been found in the basement of the old Varieties Theatre building, along with the remains of 2 other young women. The official cause of death was listed as violence by person or persons unknown, but the condition of the bodies had been so disturbing that many of the details had been omitted from the public record. As Sarah read the coroner's clinical description of Catherine Morrison's injuries, she glanced at the photograph on her screen. The screaming woman's expression of absolute terror suddenly made horrible sense. She hadn't just been frightened, she had been facing something that defied comprehension, something that had left its mark not just in the physical world, but somehow in the very fabric of time itself. The afternoon light filtering through the lab windows seemed to dim as Sarah continued her research, as if the knowledge she was uncovering was casting literal shadows across her world. And with each new piece of information, the screaming face in Dan Rice's smile seemed to become more vivid, more present, as though her investigation was somehow feeding the supernatural presence hidden within the century-old photograph. The restoration lab felt different when Sarah returned from her lunch break. The temperature had dropped noticeably, despite the building's heating system running at full capacity. Her breath was visible in small puffs as she settled back at her workstation, and the computer screen seemed to cast an unusually cold light across the scattered research materials. Sarah had spent her lunch hour in the museum's reference library, poring over city records and historical documents related to the Varieties Theatre. What she had discovered made her stomach churn with a mixture of fascination and dread. The theatre building had a long history of unexplained incidents, stretching far beyond Dan Rice's 1852 visit. Over the decades, performers and patrons alike had reported strange phenomena, disembodied voices echoing from the basement, shadows moving independently of any light source, and an overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The building had changed hands multiple times throughout the late 19th century, with each new owner eventually abandoning their efforts to maintain it as a venue for live entertainment. By 1890, it had been converted into a warehouse. By 1920, it housed a series of failed businesses that never seemed to last more than a few months. The structure had finally been demolished in 1954, but not before one final disturbing incident that had made the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. During the demolition process, workers had discovered a hidden room beneath the theater's main basement. Inside, they had found the skeletal remains of at least 7 individuals, all apparently young women based on the clothing fragments and jewelry discovered with the bones. The remains had been turned over to the medical examiner, but the case had gone cold when no missing person reports could be matched to the victims. Now, as Sarah studied the Dan Rice photograph on her screen, she couldn't shake the feeling that those 7 women had all met the same fate as Catherine Morrison, and somehow Catherine's final moments had been captured within the daguerreotype, preserved in silver and time like an insect trapped in amber. She adjusted the contrast settings one more time, trying to bring out additional details in the hidden image. As the enhancement processed, something unprecedented happened. The screaming woman's mouth appeared to move slightly, opening wider as if her silent scream was growing more intense. Sarah blinked hard and leaned closer to the screen, certain that her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. But the movement happened again. This time she was sure of it. Catherine Morrison's face was no longer completely static within Dan Rice's painted smile. Her expression was shifting, becoming more desperate, more immediate. The pale hands that surrounded her seemed to be grasping more tightly, pulling her deeper into whatever darkness lay beyond the frame of the photograph. Sarah's office chair squeaked as she pushed back from her desk, her heart pounding. She had worked with thousands of historical images over the years, but she had never seen anything like this. Photographs were static records of moments frozen in time, not dynamic windows into ongoing events. Yet the evidence on her screen suggested that something was very wrong with her understanding of how the physical world worked. She reached for her phone to call Dr. Hartwell, then hesitated. Her supervisor had already expressed concern about Sarah's mental state that morning, and claiming that a century-old photograph was somehow moving would only reinforce those worries. Instead, she decided to document what she was seeing. If the image was indeed changing, she could create a time-lapse sequence that would provide objective evidence of the phenomenon. Sarah set up her camera equipment and began taking high-resolution photographs of the computer screen at 30-second intervals. As she worked, she kept one eye on the hidden image within Dan Rice's smile. Catherine Morrison's face continued to shift subtly, her expression cycling through different stages of terror and desperation. Sometimes she appeared to be looking directly out of the screen, her eyes meeting Sarah's with a plea for help that transcended the boundaries of time and death. The pale hands surrounding Catherine's face were also changing. What had initially appeared to be static grasping motions now seemed more coordinated, more purposeful. The hands were working together to drag Catherine deeper into the painted smile, and with each subtle movement, her face became slightly smaller, slightly more distant, as if she were being pulled away from the surface of the photograph and into some unimaginable depth. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah noticed that the changes were accelerating. What had initially been barely perceptible shifts in Catherine's expression were becoming more obvious, more dramatic. Her mouth opened wider with each passing hour, her eyes grew more desperate, and the hands clutching at her seemed to multiply, reaching for her from angles that defied the two-dimensional nature of the photograph. But it wasn't just the hidden image that was changing. Dan Rice's painted smile, which had remained static throughout Sarah's restoration work, was also beginning to shift. The theatrical grin that had seemed so benign that morning was taking on a malevolent quality. The corners of his mouth appeared to be stretching wider, creating more space for Catherine's terrified face to become visible. His eyes, which had previously held the merry twinkle of a professional entertainer, now seemed to gleam with something darker, more predatory. By 4 p.m., Sarah was no longer alone in noticing the changes. Janet Rodriguez, one of the museum's security guards, stopped by the restoration lab during her routine rounds and immediately commented on the temperature. "Is your heating broken in here?" Janet asked, rubbing her arms against the cold. "It feels like a freezer." Sarah looked up from her work, realizing that the chill in the air had intensified throughout the afternoon. Her breath was now clearly visible, and frost was beginning to form around the edges of the lab windows, despite the October weather being relatively mild outside. "I hadn't really noticed," Sarah lied, not wanting to explain that the temperature seemed to drop whenever she focused intensely on the Dan Rice photograph. "I've been too absorbed in this restoration project." Janet approached the workstation and glanced at the screen. Her expression immediately changed from casual friendliness to something approaching alarm. "What is that?" she asked, pointing at the monitor. Sarah followed Janet's gaze and felt her heart skip a beat. Catherine Morrison's face was now clearly visible within Dan Rice's smile, even without digital enhancement. The screaming woman's image had somehow pushed through whatever barrier had previously hidden it from casual observation, and her expression of absolute terror was unmistakable. "It's a complex restoration project," Sarah said carefully, watching Janet's reaction. "I'm trying to recover some image data that was hidden beneath the surface damage." Janet stared at the screen for several long moments, her face growing pale. "That woman looks like she's screaming," she said quietly. "And those hands, it looks like something's trying to grab her." Before Sarah could respond, Janet stumbled backward, her eyes wide with sudden fear. "I need to finish my rounds," she said hastily, practically fleeing from the lab. Sarah was left alone with the photograph, but she no longer felt alone. The presence of Catherine Morrison was becoming stronger, more immediate. The screaming woman's face was no longer confined to Dan Rice's painted smile. Her image was beginning to bleed outward, becoming visible in other areas of the photograph. Her terrified expression was appearing in the shadows of Rice's costume, in the background darkness behind his figure, even in the grain and texture of the daguerreotype itself. And with Catherine's growing visibility came something else, the unmistakable sound of a woman screaming. It was faint at first, barely audible above the hum of the lab equipment. But as the afternoon progressed, the screaming grew louder, more desperate, more present. It seemed to be coming from the computer speakers, even though no audio file was playing. It was the sound of a woman in absolute terror, crying out across the centuries for help that had never come. Sarah realized with growing horror that her restoration work hadn't just revealed Catherine Morrison's hidden image. Somehow, it had awakened her, bringing her back from whatever nightmare she had been trapped in for the past 170 years. And Catherine Morrison was no longer content to remain silent within the confines of a century-old photograph. Sarah left the museum that evening with the Dan Rice photograph saved on her laptop and a growing certainty that she was dealing with something far beyond her expertise as a digital restoration specialist. The screaming had followed her all the way to the parking garage, echoing faintly from her laptop speakers, even though the device was closed and supposedly sleeping. Every few minutes, she heard Catherine Morrison's voice calling out in desperate, wordless agony. Her apartment in the central West End felt like a sanctuary until she opened her laptop at the kitchen table. The moment the screen illuminated, the temperature in her cozy space dropped 20 degrees, and Catherine's screaming resumed with renewed intensity. The hidden image had grown even clearer during the drive home, spreading beyond Dan Rice's smile to encompass nearly half of the photograph. Catherine's face was no longer a subtle presence requiring digital enhancement to detect. She was unmistakably there, her expression cycling through different stages of terror as those pale hands continued their relentless pull into darkness. Sarah made herself a pot of strong coffee and settled in for what she suspected would be another sleepless night. If Catherine Morrison was trying to communicate something beyond pure anguish, Sarah needed to understand what that message might be. She began by researching everything she could find about Dan Rice himself, looking for connections that might explain how a missing woman's final moments had become trapped within his photograph. What she discovered painted a picture of a man far more complex than the jolly entertainer of popular memory. Daniel McLaren Rice had been born in New York in 1823 and had risen to fame as a circus performer, comedian, and political satirist. By 1852, he was one of the most recognizable figures in American entertainment, drawing crowds of thousands wherever he performed. But there were darker aspects to his biography that most histories glossed over or ignored entirely. Sarah found references to scandals that had followed Rice from city to city during his touring years. Young women had gone missing in Buffalo, Cincinnati, and Louisville during his engagements, though no direct connection to Rice had ever been proven. In each case, the disappearances had occurred after evening performances, and in each case, the missing women had been described as attractive, well-dressed, and from respectable families. More disturbing still were the accounts she found in the personal papers of Thomas Butler, a St. Louis journalist who had covered Rice's 1852 performances for the Missouri Republican. Butler's private journals, housed in the Missouri Historical Society's archives and recently digitized, contained observations that had never made it into his published articles. According to Butler's notes, there had been something profoundly unsettling about Rice's final performances in St. Louis. The clown's usual repertoire of political jokes and trained animal acts had been supplemented by what Butler described as demonstrations of the magnetic arts, what modern audiences would recognize as stage hypnosis. Rice had called volunteers from the audience, primarily young women, and had put them into trance states that seemed to go far beyond typical stage entertainment. Butler wrote that several audience members had expressed concern about the intensity of Rice's hypnotic demonstrations. The volunteers had appeared to enter states of complete unconsciousness, remaining motionless and unresponsive for extended periods, while Rice performed what he called experiments in mesmerism. More troubling still, some of the volunteers had difficulty awakening from their trances, requiring physical intervention from concerned family members. Sarah paused in her reading to glance at her laptop screen. Catherine Morrison's face was staring directly at her now, no longer trapped within Dan Rice's smile, but occupying the entire lower half of the photograph. Her mouth was open in a scream that seemed to grow more urgent with each passing hour, and her eyes held a desperation that transcended the boundaries between life and death. She returned to Butler's journals, looking for any specific mention of Catherine Morrison. What she found made her hands tremble as she read. On October 14, 1852, the night Catherine had disappeared, Butler had written, "Rice's demonstration tonight exceeded all bounds of propriety. A young woman of obvious quality, Miss M. of Walnut Street, volunteered for his mesmeric experiment. The nature of the trance state he induced appeared far deeper than any I have previously witnessed." The young lady remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes while Rice performed his manipulations, speaking to her in low tones that the audience could not hear. When family members attempted to rouse her, she did not respond. Rice claimed this was normal and insisted on continuing his demonstration. The young woman was eventually awakened, but she appeared profoundly disturbed, speaking of visions that made no sense to those present. She left the theater in visible distress, accompanied by what I assumed to be family members. I have since learned that she never arrived home that evening. Sarah's coffee had grown cold as she read, but she barely noticed. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, revealing a picture that was more horrifying than she had imagined. Catherine Morrison hadn't simply been the victim of a random crime. She had been selected specifically by Dan Rice during one of his hypnotic demonstrations. Whatever he had done to her during that 20-minute trance had left her vulnerable to whatever fate had befallen her later that evening, but there was more to Butler's account. His final entry about the Rice performances, dated October 16th, described the aftermath of Catherine's disappearance. The authorities questioned Rice about the missing young woman, but he claimed no knowledge of her fate beyond their interaction during the evening's entertainment. However, I observed him departing his hotel that morning with a large photographic apparatus and several chemical cases. When I inquired about his activities, he stated that he was preserving certain memories of his St. Louis engagement. The nature of his photographic work was not explained, but I noted that he spent considerable time in the basement of the Varieties Theatre before his abrupt departure from the city. Sarah leaned back in her chair, pieces of the horrifying puzzle clicking into place. Rice had been using photography in connection with his hypnotic experiments. The daguerreotype that now displayed Catherine Morrison's screaming face hadn't simply captured her image by accident. It had been taken during or immediately after whatever terrible fate had befallen her in the theatre's basement. As this realization settled over her, the screaming from her laptop speakers intensified. Catherine's voice was no longer a distant echo across the centuries. It was immediate, present, desperate. She was trying to communicate something beyond her terror, trying to convey information that might prevent others from sharing her fate. Sarah opened a new document and began typing, creating a timeline of events based on her research. As she worked, she became aware that Catherine's screaming was beginning to form patterns, rhythms that almost resembled speech. The sounds were still wordless, but there was an intentionality to them that suggested Catherine was trying to guide Sarah's investigation toward some specific discovery. The revelation came suddenly, like a flash of lightning illuminating a dark landscape. Rice hadn't just photographed Catherine Morrison during her final moments. He had used his hypnotic abilities to trap her consciousness within the image itself. The daguerreotype wasn't simply a record of her death. It was a prison that had held her soul captive for more than a century and a half. And now, through Sarah's restoration work, Catherine Morrison was finally finding a way to escape that supernatural captivity. But her freedom came with a terrible price. Each hour that passed brought her closer to full manifestation in the physical world, and with her came the vengeful presence of all the other women who had suffered similar fates at Dan Rice's hands. The apartment grew colder as Sarah worked, and she became aware that she was no longer alone. Shadows moved independently of any light source, and she could hear the faint sounds of multiple voices joining Catherine's screaming. Other victims were awakening, drawn by Catherine's growing strength and their shared desire for justice. Sarah realized with growing horror that her restoration work had done more than reveal a hidden image. It had opened a doorway between the world of the living and the realm where Rice's victims had been trapped for generations. And something was beginning to come through that doorway, something that had been waiting patiently for more than a century for the chance to settle old debts with the living world. Sarah woke on her kitchen floor at 3:17 a.m., her laptop still open beside her, the screen casting an eerie blue glow across her apartment. She had no memory of falling asleep, but her neck ached from the awkward position, and her clothes were damp with perspiration, despite the frigid temperature that had settled over her living space. The screaming had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt somehow more threatening than Catherine Morrison's anguished cries. She pulled herself upright and looked at the laptop screen, immediately wishing she hadn't. The Dan Rice photograph had changed dramatically during the hours she had been unconscious. Catherine's face now occupied the entire frame, her features stretched and distorted, as if she were pressing against the inside surface of the screen, trying to break through into the physical world. Her eyes were wide with an intensity that went beyond terror. There was purpose there now, determination, and something that might have been hope. But Catherine was no longer alone in the image. Behind her, barely visible in the shadowy depths of the photograph, other faces were beginning to emerge. Young women with period dress and hairstyles from the 1850s, all bearing expressions of anguish and rage that had been fermenting for generations. Sarah counted at least 6 distinct faces, though more seemed to be materializing even as she watched. Her phone rang, startling her so badly that she nearly knocked the laptop off the table. The caller ID showed Dr. Hartwell's number, which was odd considering the early hour. Sarah answered with a voice made hoarse by sleep and fear. "Sarah, thank God you answered." Dr. Hartwell's voice was tight with anxiety. "I need you to come to the museum immediately. Something's wrong with the building." "What kind of wrong?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The security system has been malfunctioning since midnight. Motion detectors are triggering in empty rooms. Temperature sensors are reading impossible fluctuations. And Janet Rodriguez swears she's been hearing screaming coming from the restoration lab. The whole building feels like a freezer, and we can't get the heating system to respond." Sarah glanced at her laptop screen where Catherine Morrison's face had begun to turn toward her, as if aware of the conversation. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, closing the laptop, and immediately feeling the temperature in her apartment begin to return to normal. The drive to the museum through the empty St. Louis streets gave Sarah time to think about what was happening. Catherine Morrison and the other victims weren't simply manifestations of past trauma, they were actively growing stronger, feeding off the attention and energy that Sarah's investigation had brought to their supernatural prison. Every hour that passed increased their ability to affect the physical world, and it was becoming clear that they had no intention of remaining confined to the digital realm of the restored photograph. The Missouri History Museum building loomed against the pre-dawn sky like a Gothic monument, its windows dark except for the emergency lighting that cast long shadows across the Forest Park grounds. Sarah used her keycard to enter through the staff entrance, immediately noticing that her breath was visible in the supposedly climate-controlled lobby. The building's heating system was indeed failing, but not from any mechanical malfunction. The supernatural presence that had followed her work home was now spreading throughout the entire structure. She found Dr. Hartwell in the security office with Janet Rodriguez and 2 other guards, all of them bundled in heavy coats and looking deeply unsettled. The bank of monitoring screens showed feeds from cameras throughout the building, and several of them displayed obvious anomalies. In the restoration lab, shadows moved independently of any light source. In the Civil War exhibit, display cases appeared to be rattling without any external vibration. Most disturbing of all, the camera monitoring the main staircase clearly showed the translucent figure of a woman in 1850s dress ascending to the 2nd floor, her image flickering like a badly tuned television signal. "It started about an hour after you left yesterday," Dr. Hartwell explained, her voice betraying the strain of trying to maintain professional composure in the face of impossible circumstances. The temperature dropped first, then the motion detectors began triggering. "Janet was on her rounds when she heard the screaming coming from your lab." Sarah looked at Janet, who nodded grimly. "It wasn't like anything I've ever heard before," the security guard said. "It sounded like multiple women, all screaming at once. And when I tried to get close to the restoration lab, the door handle was so cold it burned my hand through my gloves." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of screaming began again, echoing through the building's ventilation system. But this time, Sarah could make out distinct voices within the cacophony. Catherine Morrison's voice was the strongest, but she was joined by others, all young women, all crying out in languages and accents that suggested they came from different regions and possibly different time periods. "We need to evacuate the building," Dr. Hartwell said, but Sarah shook her head. "Running won't solve this," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "This started with the Dan Rice photograph, and it's going to continue spreading until we find a way to address what these women want." "What they want?" Dr. Hartwell's professional skepticism was warring with the evidence of her own senses. "Sarah, are you suggesting that we're dealing with actual supernatural phenomena?" Before Sarah could answer, every screen in the security office flickered simultaneously. When the images stabilized, they no longer showed feeds from the building's cameras. Instead, each monitor displayed a different view of what appeared to be the basement of the old Varieties Theatre. The images were grainy and sepia-toned, as if they were being transmitted from the 1850s themselves. On one screen, they could see Dan Rice setting up photographic equipment in a stone-walled chamber. On another, young women in period dress stood in trance-like states, their eyes vacant and their bodies motionless. A third monitor showed what appeared to be an altar or ritual circle, surrounded by strange symbols and lit by flickering candles. But it was the 4th screen that made everyone in the security office gasp in horror. It showed Catherine Morrison, fully conscious and screaming, being held down by invisible hands while Dan Rice positioned his camera. Her terror was absolute, her struggles desperate, and her screams were the same ones they had been hearing throughout the building. "He's not just photographing them," Sarah whispered, the full horror of Rice's activities finally becoming clear. "He's using the camera as part of some kind of ritual. He's trapping their souls in the images." The screens flickered again, and suddenly the security office was filled with the translucent figures of young women in 1850s dress. They stood in a circle around the group of living people, their faces bearing expressions of pain and rage that had been building for generations. Catherine Morrison stood directly in front of Sarah, her mouth moving in what appeared to be speech, though no sound emerged. Sarah found herself able to understand Catherine's silent words, as if the supernatural connection they had formed through the restoration process allowed for direct communication. Catherine was trying to tell her something about Dan Rice, something about how his ritual could be undone, and how the trapped souls could finally be freed. But as Catherine's message became clearer, Sarah realized with growing dread that freeing the victims would require more than simply deleting the digital file. The souls trapped in Rice's photographs were connected to physical objects, the original daguerreotypes, and the chemical processes he had used to create them. And according to Catherine's desperate communication, those original photographs were still in existence, hidden somewhere in St. Louis, continuing to serve as supernatural prisons for their captured victims. The building shook with what felt like an earthquake, though Sarah knew that no seismic activity was responsible. The walls of the security office began to crack, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on every surface. The trapped souls were growing stronger, fed by decades of rage and the promise of eventual justice. But their increasing power was threatening to tear apart the barrier between the living world and whatever realm Dan Rice had consigned them to. Sarah realized that she had perhaps hours, not days, to find Rice's hidden collection of soul-trapping photographs and discover how to reverse the supernatural prison he had created. Because if Catherine Morrison and her fellow victims succeeded in breaking through completely, their century and a half of accumulated rage would be unleashed on a world that was utterly unprepared for their vengeful return. The Missouri Historical Society's archives were housed in a climate-controlled underground facility beneath the main library building on Skinker Boulevard. Sarah had obtained emergency access through Dr. Hartwell's administrative credentials, though she hadn't explained the full urgency of her mission. The curator remained at the museum with the security team, trying to manage the escalating supernatural crisis, while Sarah pursued what might be their only hope of resolving it. As she descended into the archives at 6 a.m., Sarah carried her laptop containing the restored Dan Rice photograph. The screaming had resumed during the drive across the city, and Catherine Morrison's face now pressed so close to the screen's surface that it appeared she might break through at any moment. The other victims were becoming clearer as well, their faces emerging from the background darkness with increasing definition and rage. The archives were a maze of climate-controlled corridors lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves containing documents, photographs, and artifacts dating back to St. Louis's founding. Sarah had called ahead to request assistance from the night archivist, Dr. Marcus Webb, a thin, elderly man who had spent 40 years cataloguing the city's historical materials. "You're looking for items related to Dan Rice's 1852 visit?" Dr. Webb asked as he led her through the corridors. "That's a rather specific request for such an early hour. Is this connected to the photograph you've been restoring at the museum?" Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to explain the full situation without sounding completely unhinged. "I'm researching some unusual aspects of his photographic work. There may have been additional daguerreotypes created during his St. Louis engagement that weren't part of the original museum acquisition." Dr. Webb paused at a junction between corridors, consulting a tablet that contained the digital catalog system. "There are several collections that might contain relevant materials. The Varieties theatre papers were donated in 1976, along with some personal effects from the building's final owner. There's also the Morrison family collection, which was acquired just last year." The mention of the Morrison name made Sarah's heart skip a beat. "The Morrison family collection?" "Yes, quite extensive actually. The family had been prominent in St. Louis society since the 1840s. The collection included business records, personal correspondence, and a number of photographic materials from the mid-19th century. Sadly, it was donated after the death of the last family member, an elderly woman named Margaret Morrison Ellsworth, who claimed to be the great-great-niece of a Catherine Morrison who disappeared in 1852. Sarah's hands trembled as she processed this information. Catherine Morrison's family had preserved materials related to her disappearance for over 170 years, passing down the story and whatever evidence they had managed to gather through 6 generations. The collection might contain crucial information about Dan Rice's activities, possibly even some of the original soul-trapping daguerreotypes. Dr. Webb led her to a secure storage room where the Morrison family materials were housed in acid-free boxes arranged on metal shelving. As they entered the room, Sarah's laptop speakers emitted such a loud scream that both she and Dr. Webb jumped backward. Catherine's face was now fully pressed against the screen, her eyes wide with desperate excitement, as if she recognized that they were close to something important. "What in God's name was that?" Dr. Webb asked, staring at the laptop with obvious alarm. "Audio feedback from the restoration software," Sarah lied, quickly closing the laptop to silence Catherine's screaming. "The old recording equipment sometimes picks up interference." Dr. Webb didn't look convinced, but he helped her locate the relevant boxes from the Morrison collection. As soon as Sarah opened the first container, the temperature in the storage room plummeted. Her breath became visible, and frost began forming on the metal shelving despite the archive's carefully controlled environment. Inside the first box, she found Margaret Morrison Ellsworth's personal notes about her ancestor's disappearance. The handwritten pages, dated just months before the elderly woman's death, told a story that had been passed down through the family for generations. According to Margaret's account, Catherine Morrison had confided in her younger sister Emma about strange dreams and visions that had begun after attending Dan Rice's hypnotic demonstration. Catherine had told Emma that she felt as though part of her consciousness had been left behind in the theater, trapped in some kind of liminal space between waking and sleeping. She had experienced vivid nightmares about being photographed while unable to move or speak, and she had become convinced that Dan Rice had done something to her mind during the 20-minute trance. More disturbing still were Catherine's claims that she could hear other voices in her dreams, young women calling out for help from what she described as a place of silver and shadows. She had planned to return to the Varieties Theatre on the night of her disappearance to confront Rice about what he had done to her. She had never been seen alive again, but it was the contents of the second box that made Sarah's blood run cold. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, were 3 daguerreotypes that Margaret Morrison Ellsworth had acquired from various sources over the decades. According to her notes, she had spent her entire adult life tracking down photographic materials connected to Dan Rice's St. Louis visit, convinced that they held the key to understanding what had happened to her ancestor. The first daguerreotype showed Dan Rice in his performance costume, but it was clearly a different image than the one Sarah had been restoring. In this photograph, Rice's painted smile held a sinister quality that was unmistakable, and his eyes seemed to gleam with malevolent intelligence. But it was the background of the image that was most disturbing. Shadows moved independently of any light source, and faces could be glimpsed in the darkness behind the clown's figure. The second daguerreotype was a group portrait of young women in 1850s dress, but their faces were all wrong. Each woman's expression was frozen in a moment of absolute terror, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that suggested they were looking at something beyond human comprehension. Their mouths were open as if screaming, but the silver surface of the daguerreotype captured only silent anguish. It was the third photograph that confirmed Sarah's worst fears about Dan Rice's activities. The image showed the basement of the Varieties Theatre, but it had been transformed into what could only be described as a ritual chamber. Strange symbols covered the stone walls, and photographic equipment was arranged in a circle around what appeared to be an altar. On the altar lay the body of a young woman in a white dress, her face peaceful in death, but her hands positioned as if she had died while struggling against invisible bonds. As Sarah examined the third daguerreotype more closely, she realized that the woman on the altar was Catherine Morrison. This was the photograph that had been taken during or immediately after her death, capturing not just her physical form, but somehow trapping her soul within the silver and chemical matrix of the image itself. But there was something else in the photograph, something that made Sarah's hands shake as she held the daguerreotype up to the archive room's fluorescent lighting. Standing behind the altar, barely visible in the shadows, was another figure. It wasn't Dan Rice. This person was taller, thinner, and dressed in the black robes of what appeared to be some kind of occult practitioner. Dan Rice hadn't been working alone. He had been part of a larger organization, a group that had been using entertainment venues as hunting grounds for victims and photographic technology as a means of trapping souls for some unimaginable purpose. As this realization struck her, every light in the archive room flickered simultaneously. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees, and Sarah could hear the sound of multiple women screaming, not from her laptop this time, but from the daguerreotypes themselves. Catherine Morrison and the other victims had been trapped in these physical photographs for over a century, and Sarah's discovery of their prison was causing them to react with desperate intensity. Dr. Webb had backed against the storage room door, his face pale with terror as he watched frost form on the archive boxes and heard the impossible sounds of 19th century screaming echoing from antique photographs. "What have you brought into my archives?" he whispered. Before Sarah could answer, all 3 daguerreotypes began to change. The silver surfaces rippled like liquid mercury, and the trapped images started to move. Catherine Morrison sat up on the ritual altar, her mouth opening in a scream that transcended the boundaries between the photographic and physical realms. The group of terrified women began turning their heads towards Sarah, their expressions shifting from anguish to desperate hope. And most terrifying of all, Dan Rice's painted smile began to stretch wider, creating space for words to emerge from the century-old image. "She has found us, my dear colleagues. Our work can finally be completed." Dr. Webb fled the archive room in terror, leaving Sarah alone with the 3 animated daguerreotypes. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the underground corridors as he ran toward the exit, but Sarah barely noticed his departure. Her attention was fixed on the impossible sight before her. 19th century photographs that had become windows into a supernatural realm where the dead could speak and move as if they were still alive. Dan Rice's voice continued to emerge from his daguerreotype, though his painted lips didn't move in sync with the words. The sound seemed to come from the silver surface itself, as if the entire photograph had become a speaker, broadcasting from beyond the grave. "Miss Mitchell," the voice said, somehow knowing her name. "How delightful to finally meet the young woman who has been so helpful in awakening our subjects. Your restoration work has been most illuminating." Sarah forced herself to speak, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" Dan Rice's image shifted within the photograph, his body turning to face her more directly, despite the two-dimensional nature of the medium. "Want? My dear girl, we already have everything we need. Thanks to your efforts, the barriers between our realm and yours have become delightfully thin. Our colleagues in the Order of the Silver Veil have been waiting patiently for this moment for over a century." The mention of an organization made Sarah's blood run cold. She had suspected that Rice hadn't been working alone, but the confirmation that he was part of an organized group suggested that the supernatural threat was far larger than she had imagined. "The Order of the Silver Veil?" she asked, hoping to learn more about what she was facing. Rice's painted smile widened impossibly, stretching beyond the natural limits of human anatomy. "A society of like-minded individuals dedicated to the exploration of consciousness and the preservation of souls. We discovered that the photographic process, when combined with certain mesmeristic techniques and ritualistic preparations, could capture more than mere physical appearance. We could trap the very essence of a person within the silver matrix of a daguerreotype." As Rice spoke, the other two photographs began to show increased activity. Catherine Morrison had risen from the ritual altar and was now standing at the edge of her image, pressing her hands against what appeared to be an invisible barrier. The group of terrified women were all turning towards Sarah, their mouths moving in silent pleas for help. "But why?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Why trap these women's souls?" "For the advancement of knowledge, of course," Rice replied, his tone suggesting that the answer should have been obvious. "Death is such a waste of accumulated experience and wisdom. By preserving consciousness within our photographic matrices, we could study the nature of the soul indefinitely. These young women have provided us with invaluable data about the persistence of identity beyond physical death." Sarah looked at Catherine Morrison's desperate expression and felt rage building in her chest. "They're not research subjects. They're human beings who have been tortured for over a century." Rice's laughter echoed through the archive room, a sound like glass breaking in reverse. "Human beings cease to exist at the moment of death, Miss Mitchell. What you see before you are simply preserved patterns of consciousness, no different from the grooves on a phonograph record. They have been our most successful experiment, and thanks to your restoration work, they will soon be able to contribute to an even grander project." The temperature in the room continued to drop, and Sarah realized that the supernatural activity was affecting the entire underground facility. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power system struggled with the electromagnetic interference generated by the animated photographs. She could hear alarms sounding in distant corridors, and the building's climate control system whined as it fought against the unnatural cold. "What grander project?" she asked, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. Dan Rice's image began to expand within its daguerreotype, his figure growing larger and more detailed, as if he were moving closer to the surface of the photograph. "The Order of the Silver Veil has spent decades perfecting our techniques. We have preserved dozens of subjects in cities across America, all of them waiting patiently for the moment when the barriers between realms would become thin enough for us to complete our great work." As Rice spoke, Sarah became aware that other voices were joining his. Faint at first, but growing stronger, the sounds of men speaking in cultured 19th century accents began to emerge from hidden speakers throughout the archive room. She realized with growing horror that there were other photographs nearby, other members of the Order whose consciousness had been preserved in the same supernatural prison that held their victims. "Your restoration work has provided the catalyst we needed," Rice continued. "By bringing Catherine Morrison so close to full manifestation, you have created a resonance effect that is awakening our preserved subjects throughout the region. Soon we will have an army of consciousness freed from the limitations of physical death." The implications of Rice's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't just awakened Catherine Morrison and the other immediate victims. Her work had somehow triggered a supernatural chain reaction, that was affecting every soul-trapping photograph the Order had ever created. Across St. Louis and possibly beyond, the preserved consciousness of both victims and perpetrators were beginning to manifest in the physical world. She looked at the daguerreotype containing Catherine Morrison, who was now frantically gesturing and pointing towards something outside the frame of her image. Sarah realized that Catherine was trying to communicate crucial information, perhaps about how to reverse the process or stop the Order's plan from reaching completion. "Catherine's trying to tell me something," Sarah said, more to herself than to Rice. "Oh yes, dear Catherine has always been one of our most communicative subjects," Rice replied with obvious amusement. "She has spent considerable time attempting to warn potential rescuers about our activities. Such dedication to a hopeless cause is quite admirable, really." But as Sarah watched Catherine's desperate gestures more closely, she began to understand what the trapped woman was trying to convey. Catherine was pointing downward, repeatedly, as if indicating that something important was located beneath the archive room. She was also making motions that looked like she was trying to break something, repeatedly bringing her hands together, as if snapping a stick or tearing paper. The realization came suddenly. Catherine was telling her that the source of the Order's power was located underground, beneath even this sub-basement archive facility, and she was suggesting that this source could be destroyed, breaking the supernatural hold that kept the trapped souls in their photographic prisons. "There's something beneath this building," Sarah said, watching Rice's reaction carefully. "Something that powers your whole operation." For the first time since she had begun communicating with the clown's trapped consciousness, Rice's confident demeanor wavered slightly. His painted smile flickered, and his eyes showed what might have been concern. "My dear Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "there are some secrets that are far too dangerous for the living to discover. I would strongly advise against pursuing this particular line of investigation." But Catherine Morrison was nodding vigorously within her photograph, her expression showing the first hope Sarah had seen since the restoration process began. Whatever lay beneath the archive building, it represented a chance to free the trapped souls and stop the Order of the Silver Veil from completing their supernatural plan. Sarah gathered up the 3 daguerreotypes, despite Rice's increasingly frantic protests emerging from his image. As she prepared to leave the archive room, she could hear the sound of more voices awakening throughout the building, dozens of preserved consciousness calling out from photographs that had been stored in the facility's collections for decades. The Order of the Silver Veil's century-long plan was approaching its culmination, but Catherine Morrison had just shown Sarah that there might still be a way to stop it. She would have to venture into the deepest levels of the building, into spaces that probably weren't on any official blueprints, to find whatever power source the Order had hidden beneath St. Louis more than 170 years ago. Sarah found the concealed entrance behind a false wall in the archive building's mechanical room, 3 levels below the main storage area. The daguerreotypes she carried had grown increasingly active during her descent, with Catherine Morrison's image now showing her actively fighting against the invisible barriers of her photographic prison. The other trapped women had joined Catherine's struggle, their 19th-century faces pressed against the surfaces of their images like prisoners looking through cell windows. Dan Rice's protests had grown more desperate as Sarah approached whatever lay hidden beneath the building. His painted face twisted with rage within his daguerreotype, and his voice took on an increasingly threatening tone as he realized that she was beyond his ability to manipulate or intimidate. The mechanical room's false wall had been cunningly disguised to look like part of the building's original 1920s construction, but Sarah noticed that the mortar between certain bricks was a different color and texture. When she pressed against these specific bricks in the sequence Catherine had indicated through frantic gestures, a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow stone staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The air that flowed up from the hidden passage was thick with the smell of chemicals and something else, a sweet, cloying odor that reminded Sarah of flowers left too long in a closed room. She used her phone's flashlight to illuminate the stairs, noting that they were carved from the same limestone that formed the bedrock beneath St. Louis. This passage was far older than the archive building above. It had been here long before the Missouri Historical Society had constructed their facility. As she descended, the temperature continued to drop, and the voices emerging from the daguerreotypes grew more intense. Catherine Morrison was no longer alone in trying to communicate. All of the trapped women were now attempting to guide Sarah toward whatever lay at the bottom of the hidden staircase. Their voices blended together in a chorus of whispered instructions and warnings that seemed to bypass her ears entirely, speaking directly to her consciousness. The staircase ended at a heavy wooden door bound with iron straps that had been oxidized black with age. Strange symbols had been carved into the wood, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the light from Sarah's phone. When she touched the door handle, it was so cold that it burned her skin even through her gloves, but the door swung open easily, as if it had been waiting for her arrival. Beyond the door lay a chamber that took Sarah's breath away. The room was enormous, easily 50 feet across and 20 feet high, with walls of dressed limestone that had been carved with thousands of photographs. Not modern photographs, but daguerreotypes and other early photographic processes, each one embedded directly into the stone wall like tiles in a mosaic. The images covered every available surface, creating a gallery of faces that spanned decades of the Order of the Silver Veil's activities. In the center of the chamber stood a massive photographic apparatus unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It was built around what appeared to be a camera from the 1850s, but the device had been modified with additional lenses, mirrors, and chemical apparatus that created a complex array of interconnected components. Silver tubes snaked across the floor, connecting the central camera to smaller devices positioned throughout the room. The entire system pulsed with a faint luminescence, as if electrical current were flowing through the silver components. But it was the chamber's ceiling that revealed the true scope of the Order's ambitions. Suspended overhead, held in place by an intricate network of silver wires, were hundreds of daguerreotypes arranged in concentric circles. Each photograph glowed with the same faint light as the camera apparatus, and Sarah could see faces moving within the images, both victims and perpetrators, all of them preserved in their supernatural prison for generations. "Welcome to the heart of silver," Dan Rice's voice echoed through the chamber, now emanating from multiple photographs simultaneously. "You are looking at more than a century of accumulated consciousness, Miss Mitchell. Every soul we have preserved, every mind we have captured, every essence we have studied. This is the repository of human experience, freed from the corruption of physical death." Sarah walked slowly around the central camera apparatus, studying its construction. The device was clearly the product of both scientific knowledge and occult practices, combining the emerging technology of photography with symbols and materials that spoke of much older traditions. Silver components dominated the construction, and Sarah remembered reading that silver had been considered a conductor of spiritual energy in various mystical traditions. "How does it work?" she asked, partly to buy time while she examined the chamber, and partly because her scientific training demanded an understanding of the mechanism she was confronting. "Consciousness is simply a pattern of energy," Rice explained, his voice now coming from dozens of photographs around the chamber. "The human soul is electrical in nature, no different from the chemical reactions that create photographic images. By combining mesmeristic techniques to separate consciousness from physical moorings with photographic processes designed to capture and preserve energy patterns, we learn to trap the very essence of a person within a silver matrix." As Rice spoke, Sarah noticed that Catherine Morrison's daguerreotype was becoming increasingly agitated. The trapped woman was pointing urgently toward a specific section of the central apparatus, a cylindrical component that seemed to serve as the focal point for all the silver tubing that connected the various devices. Within the cylinder, Sarah could see what appeared to be a single, exceptionally clear daguerreotype suspended in some kind of preservative solution. "That's the master photograph," she realized aloud, "the one that controls all the others." Rice's laughter filled the chamber, but there was a note of nervousness in his voice now. "Very perceptive, Miss Mitchell. Yes, that daguerreotype contains the consciousness of our Order's founder, the man who first discovered how to preserve the soul beyond death. He serves as the central intelligence that coordinates our network of preserved minds." Sarah approached the cylindrical component more closely, studying the photograph within. The image showed a man in 19th century formal dress, but his face was unlike anything she had ever seen. His features seemed to shift and change even as she watched, as if multiple faces were overlapping within the same image. His eyes held an intelligence that was vast and cold, and she had the disturbing impression that he was looking directly at her, despite being trapped within his photographic prison. "Augustus Blackwood," Rice continued, "philosopher, scientist, and visionary. He achieved immortality through our process in 1847, 5 years before my own preservation. He has been guiding our order's activities from within his silver sanctuary for more than 175 years. But Catherine Morrison was shaking her head frantically within her daguerreotype, her mouth forming words that Sarah was beginning to understand through their supernatural connection. Catherine was trying to tell her that Blackwood wasn't preserved by choice. He had been the first victim of the process, not its willing creator. The Order's entire foundation was built on a lie, and the man they believed to be their immortal leader was actually their first prisoner. The revelation changed everything. If Blackwood had been trapped against his will, then his consciousness might be just as eager for freedom as the other victims. And if the master photograph could be destroyed, it might break the supernatural network that held all the other souls in their photographic prisons. Sarah reached toward the cylindrical component, but the moment her fingers touched its surface, alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. The photographs embedded in the walls started glowing more brightly, and the voices of dozens of preserved Order members began shouting warnings and threats. The central camera apparatus began to move, its various components rotating and adjusting, as if it were a living creature responding to a threat. "I would not recommend that course of action." Rice's voice carried a new urgency. "The master photograph is protected by safeguards that will destroy anyone who attempts to tamper with it. Augustus Blackwood has had nearly 2 centuries to perfect his defenses." But Catherine Morrison and the other trapped women were screaming encouragement from their daguerreotypes, their voices rising above the protests of the Order members. They were telling Sarah that the safeguards were designed to protect against supernatural interference, not physical destruction. If she could break the container holding Blackwood's photograph, she might be able to shatter the entire network of preserved consciousness. Sarah pulled off her heavy winter coat and wrapped it around her hands for protection. The cylindrical component was radiating intense cold, and she could see frost forming on its surface as she prepared to strike it. The voices from the chamber walls rose to a deafening crescendo as both victims and perpetrators realized what she was about to attempt. The fate of more than a century's worth of trapped souls hung in the balance as Sarah raised her wrapped hands above the master photograph, knowing that her next action would either free the victims or doom them to eternal imprisonment in their silver prisons. Sarah brought her coat-wrapped hands down on the cylindrical component with all the force she could muster. The impact sent shockwaves through the chamber that went far beyond the physical. The very air seemed to ripple with supernatural energy as the container holding Augustus Blackwood's master photograph cracked along its length. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Every photograph embedded in the chamber walls began to pulse with brilliant silver light, and the voices of the trapped souls rose to a deafening crescendo that seemed to shake the limestone foundations of the underground space. The central camera apparatus began to spin wildly, its various components moving with mechanical precision as if trying to compensate for some critical system failure. But it was Augustus Blackwood's photograph that commanded Sarah's attention. As the preservative solution leaked from the cracked container, the master image began to change dramatically. Blackwood's shifting features stabilized for the first time, revealing the face of a middle-aged man whose expression was not one of serene immortality, but of absolute terror and rage. His mouth opened in a scream that emerged from every photograph in the chamber simultaneously, the sound of a consciousness that had been imprisoned for 175 years, finally finding its voice. "What have you done?" Dan Rice's voice cut through the chaos, his painted face contorting with fury within his daguerreotype. "You have no idea what forces you are unleashing." But Catherine Morrison's image was glowing with hope and determination. Through their supernatural connection, Sarah could feel Catherine's gratitude and encouragement flowing like a warm current through the cold chamber. The trapped woman was no longer pressing against the barriers of her photographic prison. Instead, she was gathering strength for what Sarah realized would be a coordinated escape attempt by all the victims. Sarah struck the cracked container again, and this time the cylindrical component shattered completely. Blackwood's master photograph fell to the stone floor, its silver surface immediately beginning to darken and corrode, as exposure to air reversed the chemical processes that had preserved it for nearly 2 centuries. The effect on the chamber's supernatural network was catastrophic. The photographs embedded in the walls began to flicker and fade, their silver luminescence dying like candles being extinguished one by one. The voices of the Order members grew faint and distorted, their preserved consciousness losing cohesion as the master photograph that had coordinated their network disintegrated. But the victims' photographs responded differently, Instead of fading, they began to glow more brightly, and the faces within them became clearer and more defined. Sarah realized that the destruction of Blackwood's controlling influence was finally allowing the trapped women to break free from their supernatural prisons. Catherine Morrison was the first to emerge. Her image suddenly expanded beyond the confines of her daguerreotype, becoming a three-dimensional translucent figure that stepped out of the photograph and into the chamber. She appeared exactly as she had in life, a young woman in her early 20s, wearing a dark dress and torn bonnet, her face bearing the marks of her ordeal, but her eyes bright with intelligence and determination. "Thank you," Catherine said, her voice carrying the accent and intonation of 1850s St. Louis. "We have been waiting so long for someone who could see us, someone who would listen." Other victims began to follow Catherine's example, emerging from their photographic prisons as translucent figures that filled the chamber with an eerie but somehow comforting light. They were women from different time periods, spanning the Order's decades of activity. Some in 1850s dressed like Catherine, others in clothing from the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. All of them bore the marks of their traumatic deaths, but their expressions were no longer frozen in terror. They looked relieved, grateful, and most importantly, free. Dan Rice's voice had become a barely audible whisper as his photograph faded. "The Order will not end with us," he managed to say, before his image disappeared entirely, taking with it the consciousness that had been preserved within the silver matrix for over a century. As the last of the Order members' photographs went dark, Augustus Blackwood's master image completed its deterioration. But unlike the gradual fading of the other Order members, Blackwood's release was violent and explosive. His consciousness erupted from the disintegrating photograph as a swirling mass of dark energy that filled the chamber with malevolent presence. "You have destroyed everything," Blackwood's voice thundered through the chamber, no longer coming from a photograph but manifesting as a supernatural presence that made the air itself vibrate with rage. Centuries of work, generations of accumulated knowledge, all lost because of one foolish woman's interference. The freed victims immediately moved to surround Sarah, forming a protective circle around her as Blackwood's dark presence gathered strength. Catherine Morrison stepped forward to face the man who had been the ultimate architect of their suffering. "Your work was an abomination," Catherine said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had endured unimaginable torment and emerged with her humanity intact. "You turned human souls into specimens for your twisted experiments. We are not preservations of consciousness. We are people who deserve to live and die with dignity." Blackwood's dark energy swirled around the chamber, seeking a way to reconstitute himself or to drag the freed souls back into supernatural captivity. But his power had been fatally weakened by the destruction of the master photograph, and the combined will of dozens of freed victims created a barrier he could not penetrate. "This is not over." Blackwood's voice was growing fainter as his consciousness lost cohesion. "There are other chambers, other networks. The Order extends far beyond this single location." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold in the chamber. "Other chambers?" Catherine turned to her with an expression of grim determination. "He speaks the truth. The Order of the Silver Veil established multiple preservation sites across America: Chicago, New York, New Orleans, San Francisco. Each one contains dozens of souls like us waiting for freedom." The implications were staggering. Sarah had freed the victims imprisoned beneath St. Louis, but there were potentially hundreds of other souls trapped in similar chambers throughout the country. The Order's network was far larger than she had imagined, and destroying one node would not eliminate the entire supernatural conspiracy. But as Blackwood's presence finally dissipated entirely, reduced to wisps of dark energy that faded into nothingness, Catherine placed a translucent hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You have given us our freedom," Catherine said. "And with that freedom comes the power to help others who still suffer as we did. The Order's remaining chambers can be found and destroyed, but not by you alone. This is work that the dead must do for the dead." Sarah understood. The freed souls would not simply move on to whatever afterlife awaited them. They would continue to exist in the liminal space between life and death, using their supernatural abilities to locate and free other victims of the Order's activities. Catherine Morrison and her fellow survivors would become the very force that would ultimately destroy the organization that had imprisoned them. As the last traces of the Order's supernatural apparatus failed and went dark, Sarah realized that her work was complete. She had not only freed the immediate victims, but had also set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to the liberation of every soul the Order had ever trapped. The restoration of Dan Rice's photograph had indeed revealed hidden truths, but those truths had proven to be far more complex and far-reaching than she could ever have imagined. The liberation of the St. Louis victims created ripple effects that spread across the American paranormal landscape like electromagnetic pulses racing through a vast network. As Catherine Morrison and the other freed souls dispersed from the underground chamber, their supernatural presence triggered responses in the Order's remaining preservation sites from coast to coast. Sarah felt the change immediately. The air in the heart of Silver Chamber had become lighter, no longer oppressed by the accumulated anguish of the trapped souls, but it was also charged with new energy. Through her psychic connection with Catherine Morrison, she could sense that something unprecedented was happening in cities hundreds of miles away. "They're awakening," Catherine said, her translucent form flickering as she maintained contact with supernatural activity across the continent. "The souls imprisoned in Chicago, New York, New Orleans, they can feel our freedom, and it's giving them strength to fight their own bonds." Sarah's phone, which had been dead since entering the underground chamber, suddenly sparked to life. The screen filled with news alerts and emergency broadcasts from cities across America. Reports of unexplained phenomena were flooding in from major metropolitan areas, temperature drops in specific buildings, electronic equipment failures, and witnesses claiming to see figures in 19th century clothing appearing in museums, libraries, and historical sites. In Chicago, the Historical Society building was experiencing what authorities were calling electrical anomalies that had forced the evacuation of staff and visitors. Security cameras showed translucent figures moving through the corridors, and multiple witnesses reported hearing the sounds of people screaming from empty rooms. New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art had been closed after visitors began reporting encounters with period-dressed apparitions in the American wing. The museum's climate control system had failed catastrophically, creating localized areas of extreme cold that seemed to follow specific exhibition paths through the galleries. Similar incidents were being reported from New Orleans, San Francisco, Boston, and Philadelphia. In each case, the paranormal activity seemed to center around institutions that housed historical collections, particularly those with significant 19th century photographic materials. The Order chose their preservation sites carefully, Catherine explained, as Sarah scrolled through the news reports. They established chambers beneath buildings where their activities would be hidden and protected, but they also wanted access to the artifacts and documents that would help them identify potential victims and expand their network. Through the supernatural connection they shared, Sarah could feel Catherine's growing excitement and determination. The freed souls were not simply dispersing into whatever afterlife awaited them. They were organizing themselves into a force of liberation that would systematically destroy every remaining chamber the Order had established. "We can sense each other now," Catherine continued, "all of the trapped souls across the network. Your destruction of the master photograph didn't just free us. It broke the supernatural barriers that kept the different preservation sites isolated from each other. For the first time in centuries, the victims can communicate and coordinate their efforts." Sarah watched her phone screen as new reports continued to flood in. In Chicago, witnesses were describing organized groups of translucent figures moving with apparent purpose through the Historical Society building. Security footage showed the apparitions working together to access specific areas, as if they were searching for something particular. "They're looking for their own chambers," Sarah realized. "The freed souls are teaching the still-trapped victims how to locate the source of their imprisonment." Catherine nodded, her expression fierce with anticipation. "Each chamber is similar to the one you destroyed here. A central apparatus with a master photograph controlling the local network. Once the trapped souls understand what to look for, they can guide living investigators to the right locations." The implications were staggering. Sarah had not only freed the immediate victims, but had also created a supernatural intelligence network that could expose the Order's activities across the entire country. The trapped souls, armed with knowledge of how their prisons worked and motivated by centuries of accumulated rage, would prove to be the most effective investigators possible. Her phone rang, startling her in the eerie quiet of the chamber. The caller ID showed Dr. Hartwell's number. "Sarah, thank God." Her supervisor's voice was tight with stress and exhaustion. "Where are you?" "The museum is in chaos. The temperature has returned to normal, but we've had reports of paranormal activity from historical institutions across the region. The media is calling it some kind of coordinated supernatural event. I'm at the Missouri Historical Society archives, Sarah said, which was technically true. I found the source of the phenomena. It's connected to a 19th century occult organization that was using photographic technology to trap human souls. There was a long pause before Dr. Hartwell responded. Sarah, I need you to be very careful about what you say to the authorities. Claims about occult organizations and trapped souls are going to make you sound unstable. Can you focus on the historical aspects of what you've discovered? But before Sarah could respond, Catherine interrupted with urgent news from the Supernatural Network. Chicago has found their chamber, Catherine announced, her form brightening with excitement. The trapped souls there have guided investigators to a hidden room beneath the Chicago History Museum. They're preparing to destroy their master photograph. Sarah relayed this information to Dr. Hartwell, who was silent for several long moments. How could you possibly know what's happening in Chicago? The curator finally asked. The freed souls are communicating with each other, Sarah explained, knowing how impossible it sounded. They're coordinating a simultaneous liberation effort across multiple cities. As if to confirm her words, reports began appearing on her phone from Chicago. The Chicago History Museum had just announced the discovery of a previously unknown chamber beneath their building, containing what authorities were describing as significant archaeological materials related to 19th century spiritual practices. Witnesses reported that the discovery had been guided by unexplained phenomena that had led investigators to specific locations within the building. New York is next, Catherine reported. Then New Orleans. The network is collapsing faster than the order ever imagined possible. Sarah watched in fascination as news reports continued to stream in from across the country. In each city, the pattern was the same. Supernatural phenomena guided living investigators to hidden chambers containing evidence of the Order of the Silver Veil's activities. The trapped souls were using their connection to the physical world to expose the very organization that had imprisoned them. But there was something else happening, something that filled Sarah with both hope and unease. As each chamber was discovered and destroyed, the freed souls were not simply disappearing into peaceful rest, they were growing stronger, more organized, more purposeful in their supernatural existence. We're not moving on, Catherine said, reading Sarah's thoughts through their psychic connection. Not yet. There's too much work to be done. The Order of the Silver Veil may have been dismantled, but there are other secrets buried in America's past, other injustices that need to be exposed, other victims who need advocates. Sarah realized that her restoration of Dan Rice's photograph had done more than solve a historical mystery. It had awakened a supernatural force for justice that would continue to operate long after the immediate crisis was resolved. The freed souls, led by Catherine Morrison, were becoming guardians of historical truth, using their unique abilities to expose the dark secrets that had been hidden in the shadows of American history. The Order of the Silver Veil was ending, but something new was beginning, and Sarah suspected that her work as a historical investigator was far from over. 3 days after the destruction of the St. Louis Chamber, the last of the Order of the Silver Veil's preservation sites had been exposed and destroyed. Sarah followed the news coverage from her apartment, watching as authorities in 7 major cities announced the discovery of significant archaeological finds in the underground areas of various historical institutions. The official explanations focused on 19th century scientific experiments and early photographic technology, carefully avoiding any mention of supernatural phenomena or trapped souls. But Sarah knew the truth. Through her continuing connection with Catherine Morrison, she had witnessed the systematic liberation of hundreds of victims across the American paranormal landscape. Each destroyed chamber had freed dozens of souls who had been imprisoned for generations, and with each liberation, the supernatural network of justice had grown stronger and more organized. Catherine appeared to her now not as the terrified victim from the daguerreotype, but as a confident leader, coordinating supernatural investigations across the continent. Her translucent form had taken on an ethereal quality that suggested she was adapting to her new existence between the worlds of the living and the dead. The Order's immediate threat has been eliminated, Catherine reported as she materialized in Sarah's living room. Every preservation chamber has been destroyed, and every trapped soul has been freed. But our investigation has revealed something far more disturbing than we initially understood. Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she had been documenting the week's events for a report that would probably never be believed by mainstream academia. What did you find? The Order of the Silver Veil was not the only organization of its kind, Catherine explained, her expression grave. Our freed souls have been exploring the psychic residue left by the chambers, and we've discovered evidence of other groups, other methods of preserving consciousness beyond death. The Order was part of a larger movement that has been operating in the shadows of American society for over 2 centuries. The implications made Sarah's blood run cold. How many other groups? We've identified at least 5 distinct organizations, each one using different techniques but working towards similar goals. The Order used photographic matrices to trap souls, but others experimented with spiritualist practices, mesmerism, and even early electrical technologies. They've been preserving the consciousness of both willing participants and unwilling victims, creating networks of supernatural intelligence that have been influencing American politics, business, and culture from behind the scenes. Catherine moved to the window, gazing out at the lights of St. Louis as if she could see connections and patterns invisible to living eyes. The freed souls are discovering that many of the ghost stories and haunted locations throughout American history are actually evidence of these preservation experiments. Historic houses where visitors report seeing the same apparitions year after year, battlefields where soldiers are said to march eternally, asylums and hospitals where patients never seem to find rest. These aren't random supernatural phenomena. They're the result of deliberate attempts to capture and preserve human consciousness. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Catherine was describing. You're talking about a conspiracy that spans centuries and affects the entire country. More than that, Catherine replied. We're talking about a fundamental violation of the natural order. Death is meant to be a transition, not a prison. These organizations have been trapping souls in various forms of supernatural captivity, preventing them from finding peace, and using their preserved consciousness for purposes that the living cannot even comprehend. As Catherine spoke, Sarah's laptop screen flickered, and new information began appearing in documents that seemed to be writing themselves. Names, dates, locations, all flowing from Catherine's supernatural investigation through their psychic connection into digital format. The freed souls were sharing their discoveries, creating a comprehensive database of supernatural injustice that stretched back to the founding of the American colonies. The Salem witch trials, Catherine continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone uncovering a terrible truth. Many of the accused were actually members of early preservation societies. They weren't practicing traditional witchcraft, they were experimenting with techniques to capture and preserve consciousness. The hysteria that led to their executions was partially justified fear of what they were actually doing. Sarah watched in fascination as more information appeared on her screen. Colonial-era documents describing spiritual preservation societies, Civil War records of experiments conducted on dying soldiers, Gilded Age reports of scientific investigations into the nature of consciousness. The pattern was clear. Organized attempts to cheat death and preserve human awareness had been a constant thread throughout American history. But why? Sarah asked. What was the ultimate purpose of all this preservation? Catherine turned from the window, her expression showing a mixture of anger and determination. Power, she said simply. Preserved consciousness doesn't age, doesn't forget, and doesn't die. These organizations were creating networks of immortal intelligence that could accumulate knowledge and influence across multiple generations. They were building shadow governments of the dead. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The implications went far beyond historical curiosity or supernatural investigation. If Catherine was right, then significant aspects of American development had been guided by the preserved consciousness of people who should have died centuries ago. The freed souls are organizing to address this, Catherine continued. We're no longer bound by the limitations that kept us trapped in individual chambers. We can investigate, communicate, and act on a scale that matches the threat we've discovered. But we need help from the living world. What kind of help? Documentation, verification, physical action when supernatural intervention isn't enough. Catherine moved closer to Sarah, her translucent form radiating intensity. You've become our primary contact with the living world, Sarah. Your restoration work didn't just free us from our immediate prison, it established a connection between the realms that allows us to work together. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had wanted to be a historical researcher, not a supernatural investigator fighting century-old conspiracies. But the choice had been made for her the moment she decided to restore Dan Rice's photograph. "Where do we start?" she asked. Catherine smiled, and for the first time since emerging from her photographic prison, she looked truly hopeful. "We start with the oldest preservation site in America, Boston, 1692. There's a chamber beneath the Old South Meeting House that has been operating continuously since the colonial period. The consciousness preserved there includes some of the original Salem accusers, and they've been influencing New England politics for over 3 centuries. As Catherine spoke, Sarah's laptop continued to fill with information provided by the supernatural network. Maps, building plans, historical records, all the data needed to locate and expose another chapter in America's hidden supernatural history. Sarah realized that her career as a simple restoration specialist was over. She was now part of something much larger and more dangerous, a collaboration between the living and the dead to expose the truth about America's supernatural foundations. The work would be dangerous, probably thankless, and certainly unbelievable to most people. But as she looked at Catherine Morrison's determined expression and felt the presence of hundreds of other freed souls supporting their investigation, Sarah knew that this was the most important work she could possibly do. The dead deserved justice, the truth deserved to be revealed, and the living deserved to know what forces had been shaping their history from the shadows. The Order of the Silver Veil had been destroyed, but the war against supernatural oppression was just beginning. 6 months after the destruction of the Order of the Silver Veil's preservation chambers, Sarah Mitchell stood in her new office at the Missouri History Museum. The title on her door read, Director of Supernatural Historical Research, a position that had been quietly created after the museum board reviewed her documented discoveries about 19th century preservation societies. The official explanation for her department focused on investigating unexplained phenomena in historical contexts, but Sarah and her supernatural colleagues knew the real scope of their mission. The office was equipped with the latest digital restoration equipment, but also with devices that would have been incomprehensible to conventional academics. Electromagnetic field detectors, temperature monitoring systems, and specialized cameras that could capture images across multiple spectral ranges filled the space alongside traditional historical research tools. Most importantly, a dedicated computer terminal maintained constant contact with the supernatural network that Catherine Morrison had organized among the freed souls. Catherine herself had evolved significantly since her liberation from Dan Rice's photograph. She now appeared as a confident, purposeful figure who moved easily between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Her 19th century appearance remained unchanged, but her presence carried the authority of someone who had faced ultimate horror and emerged with her humanity intact. She had become the primary coordinator of what the freed souls called the Truth Seekers, a supernatural organization dedicated to exposing the hidden history of consciousness preservation in America. "Boston has been successfully cleared," Catherine reported as she materialized beside Sarah's desk. The chamber beneath the Old South Meeting House contained 47 preserved souls dating back to 1692. The liberation was complicated by the fact that several of the consciousnesses had been willing participants in the preservation process, but they agreed to move on once they understood how their continued existence was preventing natural spiritual progression. Sarah updated her files with the Boston information, adding it to the growing database of destroyed preservation sites. In the 6 months since the St. Louis liberation, the Truth Seekers had identified and eliminated 13 major chambers across the United States. Each discovery had revealed new aspects of the conspiracy that had been operating in the shadows of American history for centuries. "Any new sites identified?" Sarah asked. "3 possibilities," Catherine replied, her translucent form flickering as she accessed information from the supernatural network. The freed souls in Philadelphia have detected psychic residue suggesting a chamber beneath Independence Hall. There are similar indications in Savannah and Denver, but these sites appear to be more recent, possibly established in the early 20th century. The discovery of newer preservation chambers had been one of the most disturbing aspects of their investigation. The practice of trapping souls in supernatural prisons hadn't ended with the Victorian era. It had continued and evolved throughout American history. Modern preservation societies had adapted their techniques to incorporate new technologies, creating hybrid systems that combined traditional occult practices with contemporary scientific methods. "There's something else," Catherine said, her expression growing serious. "We've been monitoring communications between the living members of various preservation societies. Our actions over the past 6 months have not gone unnoticed. There are groups that are still active, still practicing consciousness preservation, and they're beginning to organize a response to our investigations." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with supernatural presence. "What kind of response?" "They're attempting to create new, more secure preservation chambers, facilities that would be harder for supernatural investigation to penetrate. But more concerning, they're discussing the possibility of preserving their own consciousness as a defensive measure. If the living leadership of these societies undergoes voluntary preservation, they could continue their activities indefinitely without risk of exposure through conventional investigation." The implications were staggering. Sarah and Catherine had been assuming that they were cleaning up historical crimes, exposing centuries-old injustices, and freeing long-dead victims. But if active preservation societies were still operating and adapting their techniques in response to the truth seekers' activities, then the supernatural conspiracy was far from defeated. "How many active societies are we talking about?" Sarah asked. Catherine's form grew more solid as she concentrated on information flowing through the supernatural network. "At least 3 major organizations, possibly more. They appear to be concentrated in areas with significant political and economic influence: Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles. The preserved consciousness they've accumulated over the decades includes politicians, business leaders, and academics who have been guiding American policy from beyond the grave." Sarah leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the threat they were facing. "We're not just investigating historical crimes, we're fighting an ongoing shadow government of preserved souls." "Exactly," Catherine confirmed, "and they're becoming aware that we represent a threat to their continued existence. The freed souls have detected attempts to locate and neutralize our investigation. There have been psychic attacks on truth seekers in several cities, and we've lost contact with 3 souls who were investigating chambers on the West Coast." The revelation that their supernatural allies were vulnerable to attack added a new dimension of urgency to their work. The truth seekers had seemed invincible in their initial investigations, but they were facing opposition from preservation societies that had centuries of experience in supernatural manipulation. "What's our next move?" Sarah asked. Catherine moved to the office window, gazing out at Forest Park, as if she could see beyond the physical landscape to the hidden supernatural infrastructure that underlay American society. "We accelerate our timeline. Instead of methodically investigating and destroying chambers one at a time, we need to coordinate simultaneous strikes against multiple preservation sites. The element of surprise is our greatest advantage." As Catherine spoke, Sarah's computer terminal flickered to life with incoming data from the supernatural network. Maps appeared on the screen, showing the locations of suspected preservation chambers across the United States, along with detailed intelligence about the organizations that maintained them. The information was more comprehensive than anything conventional investigation could have produced, gathered by souls who could move unseen through the physical world and access records that had been hidden for generations. "This is it," Sarah realized. "This is our chance to end the entire conspiracy at once." "Not end," Catherine corrected. "Transform." The preserved consciousness in these chambers includes both victims and perpetrators, both the innocent and the guilty. Our goal is not simply destruction, but justice. We want to free the trapped victims while ensuring that those who participated willingly in supernatural oppression face appropriate consequences. Sarah studied the data flowing across her screen, seeing the pattern of a coordinated campaign that would require precise timing and flawless execution. The truth seekers would need to strike simultaneously at preservation sites across the continent, overwhelming the defensive capabilities of the active societies before they could mount an effective response. "When do we begin?" she asked. Catherine turned from the window, her expression showing the determination of someone who had waited 170 years for justice. "Tonight, during the new moon, when the barriers between the living and dead worlds are thinnest, the truth seekers will coordinate their final assault on the preservation conspiracy." As evening approached, Sarah prepared for what she knew would be the culminating battle in their supernatural war. She had equipment ready for documenting whatever they discovered, communication devices for coordinating with law enforcement agencies that would need to handle the physical evidence, and weapons that had been specially prepared for confronting preserved consciousness that might resist liberation. But more importantly, She had the support of hundreds of freed souls who had found purpose in their existence between life and death. Catherine Morrison and her fellow truth-seekers had transformed from victims into guardians, protectors of both the living and the dead against those who would exploit the supernatural realm for personal gain. As midnight approached and the new moon darkened the sky above St. Louis, Sarah felt the presence of the supernatural network activating across the continent. From Boston to Los Angeles, from Seattle to Miami, the truth seekers were moving into position for their coordinated strike against the last remnants of America's hidden preservation conspiracy. The work that had begun with the restoration of Dan Rice's photograph was finally approaching its conclusion. But Sarah knew that even after tonight's battle, their mission would continue. There would always be those who sought to cheat death and exploit the supernatural realm for their own purposes, and there would always be the truth seekers, eternal guardians standing watch between the worlds, ensuring that justice transcended the boundaries of life and death. The restoration was complete, the truth had been revealed, and the dead had finally found their purpose in protecting the living from the darkness that lurked in the shadows of American history.